Hello, and welcome to this recording of a coder web training session, part of the ICD-10 Manual Mortality Coding Series funded by the CDC Foundation. This presentation is the third in a three-part series of multiple cause coding instructions taken from ICD-10 Volume 2, Section 4.3. My name is Patricia Wood, and I'll be your instructor for this presentation. I work with the CDC Foundation as an ICD consultant. Although retired now, I worked at Statistics Canada, where I enjoyed a long career gaining extensive experience using both ICD-9 and ICD-10 for mortality classification. This presentation and others in this series are based on the WHO Mortality Classification Rules and Guidelines found in ICD-10 Volume 2. These rules and guidelines have been the subject of numerous updates over the years, and we use the 2016 version, which is readily available at the link on this slide. If, however, you use an older or newer version of Volume 2, please let us know. We'll be able to help you navigate any inconsistencies that may pop up. The material included in this presentation is taken from Volume 2, augmented by supplementary instructions and examples. And as usual, a short coding exercise is available to help you assess your understanding of the material covered. This slide illustrates the ICD-10 mortality classification process and is included as a refresher in all presentations in the Coder Web Training series. The first pair of boxes remind us that the source document for cause of death coding is the medical certificate of cause of death. To promote comparability of the data produced in the coding process, the WHO recommends a standard format for this certificate. This recommendation can be found in Annex 7.1 of ICD-10 Volume 2. 2016. The second pair of boxes recalls that the first step in coding the information provided on a medical certificate of cause of death is to code each entity using ICD-10 Volumes 3, the index, and Volume 1, the tabular list. And the third and final pair of boxes indicates that to accurately and consistently select the underlying cause of death for statistical tabulation, the WHO Rules and Guidelines for Mortality Classification, found in Volume 2, Chapter 4, must be applied. In Sessions 1 and 2 of this series and other videos, several subsections of Section 4.3, Coding Instructions for Mortality, Multiple Causes, have been covered. They're shown on this slide in gray tone. In this session, Session 3, we will explore the instructions at subsection 4.3.6 and 4.3.7 to complete the coding instructions for multiple causes of death. Let's begin with a review of the introduction to the concept of multiple cause coding included in Sessions 1 and 2. If you have already viewed these two videos, you can advance to new material on slide 9. Looking at the slide, multiple cause coding is essential for a correct application of the ICD-10 instructions for selection and modification of the underlying cause of death. It may have been some while since you looked at the very basics of mortality classification, but you know that in order to apply the rules for selecting the underlying cause of death, you must apply an ICD-10 code to each cause of death reported. There are no rules or guidelines suggesting that some causes of death do not need to be coded. This is necessary, for example, to use the international decision tables to determine the selection and/or modification steps applied because the relationships are represented by ICD-10 code numbers. Looking back at the slide, second bullet, multiple cause coding permits in-depth analysis of causes of death. For example, serious but avoidable complications of certain underlying causes and the impact of coexisting conditions on the outcome of a disease process. Ideally, for mortality statistics, both underlying cause and multiple causes are tabulated. Continuing with the next slide, to maximize opportunity for analysis, as much detail as possible should be retained in the multiple cause coding, such as the position of the individual codes in the data record should reflect where on the certificate the corresponding diagnostic expressions were entered by the certifier, because some analysis may focus on the terminal cause of death or on conditions reported in Part 2. And looking at the second bullet on this slide, codes for common conditions or for conditions regarded as symptomatic or less informative should not be deleted or left out, since they may be of special interest in analysis of avoidable complications and may serve as markers of the seriousness of other conditions reported on the certificate. So if it's possible to assemble and keep multiple cause codes, it would be ideal to keep as much information about them as possible. This will enhance the research that can be considered using all of the information reported on the medical certificate of cause of death. And to conclude the introduction to multiple cause coding, on this slide, there's a suggestion that multiple cause data be stored in two formats. One format that shows as clearly as possible which term the certifier used on the certificate and where on the certificate each term was reported. And one format that takes the stated or implied relationships between the reported conditions into consideration and where the codes have been harmonized according to instructions in ICD volumes. Automated mortality classification systems such as IRIS or MMDS can automatically arrange multiple cause codes in each of these formats. Some manual intervention may be required in other mortality classification scenarios. This recommendation represents the ideal data storage system, but even a very basic retention of multiple cause codes can be useful in informing the mortality situation in a jurisdiction. All right, new material. In the past two sessions, plus this one, we've been exploring how to apply the best possible code to each of the multiple causes of death reported, so as to select the most informative underlying cause of death for our statistics. For some conditions, ICD-10 provides two separate codes, one for the condition in its active phase and an alternate code for that same disease in its residual phase. By residual, we mean that the original condition is no longer active or acute, but rather that it has caused a residual effect of some sort. In cases where the alternate code for the sequela is available, we want to use it, if appropriate, so as to avoid inadvertently inflating cause of death statistics with codes representing such conditions in their active or acute phase. ICD-10 provides sequela code categories for select causes of death. A sequela is a late effect, an after effect, or a residual of a disease, nature of injury, or external cause. When there's evidence death resulted from the residual or late effects of a condition, injury, or external cause, rather than during its active phase, and ICD-10 provides a separate sequela code, code to the appropriate sequela. Code specified residual effects separately. Conditions reported as sequela or late effects of a given disease, injury, or external cause should be classified to the appropriate sequela category, irrespective of the interval between the onset of the disease or injury and death. Looking at the first paragraph of this slide, going on to say, for certain conditions, death occurring 1 year or more after the onset of the disease, injury, or external cause are assumed to be due to a sequela or residual effect of the condition, even though no sequela is explicitly mentioned. In other words, the interval between the onset and death may indicate death due to a sequela of a disease rather than death due to the active phase of that disease. In this series of coder web training videos, we adhere to the mortality classification rules and guidelines found in Chapter 4 of ICD-10 Volume 2. For the use of the sequela codes, the instructions in Volume 2 are limited, so it's necessary to augment them with material from ICD-10 Volume 1 and from NCHS Instruction Manual Part 2B, Instructions for Classifying Multiple Causes of Death. I've included on this slide the link to the NCHS instruction manuals, and I will refer to them during the presentation. On this slide and the next, you will see a complete list of conditions, injuries, and external causes that have a separate ICD-10 sequela code or code category. Notice that only the bold black titles are covered in Volume 2. On this second slide, the remainder of them. Again, only the ones in bold black title are covered in Volume 2. So I think you can see, especially on this slide, there's several sequela code categories that don't have instructions explicit instructions in Volume 2. We'll handle that with some supplementary instructions. As mentioned, some guidelines for the interpretation and use of sequela codes are given in ICD-10 Volume 1, the tabular list. For example, on this slide is some information about the use of the codes in the block B90 to B94, sequela of infectious and parasitic diseases. Let's read together. Categories B90 to B94 are to be used to indicate conditions in categories A00 to B89 as the cause of sequela, which are themselves classified elsewhere. The sequela include conditions specified as such. They also include late effects of diseases classifiable to the above categories, if there's evidence that the disease itself is no longer present. For use of these categories, reference should be made to the morbidity or mortality coding rules and guidelines in Volume 2. So please take note of the reference to the specific instructions for mortality classification that are included in Volume 2. We've arrived at the first sequela instruction included in Volume 2, subsection 4.3.6. Let's remind ourselves of a couple important facts before we dive in. First, ICD-10 does not provide a separate sequela code for every disease, only select ones as per the slides 11 and 12, where the list of sequela codes was provided. Next, sequela codes are used when there's evidence that death occurred as the result of a disease condition in its residual rather than active phase. For example, here's an instruction on the slide, how to use the sequela of tuberculosis code B90 and its subcategories. Sequela of tuberculosis include conditions classified to A16 to A19, specified as such, or as arrested, cured, healed, inactive, old, or quiescent, unless there is evidence of active tuberculosis. This code category does not include chronic tuberculosis, which should be coded as active infectious disease. A remark about the blue font used on the slide. The blue font represents material that is not included in Volume 2. So just the specification of the conditions classified to A16 to A19 is just added in for clarity. And this example is not in Volume 2. It too is just added in for clarity. So for example, applying this instruction to a certificate that had online AF Part 1, pulmonary fibrosis, and online B, old pulmonary tuberculosis. The instruction says that the sequela of tuberculosis, B90, includes conditions classified to A16 to A19 specified as old. There's no indication that this tuberculosis was other than old, so in fact, we will code line B to B90.9, sequela of respiratory and unspecified tuberculosis. A supplementary instruction here, continuing on how to use B90, sequela of tuberculosis. Just a special note that says do not use duration to code sequela of tuberculosis. In the introduction, we read a general statement saying that some sequela code categories, the interval between the onset and death may indicate death due to a sequela of disease rather than death due to the active phase of that disease. This is not the case with tuberculosis. With tuberculosis, the duration should not be used as an indication that death occurred during the residual phase of the disease rather than during its active phase. So on the supplementary example, on line C, we have pulmonary tuberculosis with a duration of 2 years. That's not enough for us to assume that that was a sequela of tuberculosis, and we would actually code line C to A16.2, tuberculosis of lung. The next mortality classification specific instruction is for sequela of trachoma, B940. Sequela of trachoma include residuals of trachoma classified to A17, specified as healed or inactive, and certain specified sequela such as blindness, conjunctival scars, unless there's evidence of active infection. It does not include chronic trachoma, which should be coded as active infectious disease. In the supplementary example included, the implication is that a conjunctival scar does not occur during trachoma in its active phase, but rather as a sequela or residual effect of trachoma after its active phase is ended. Therefore, in this example, conjunctival scar is coded on line A as indexed, and trachoma on line B is coded to B940, sequel of trachoma. Viral encephalitis is another condition for which the ICD-10 provides a separate sequela code. Looking at the instruction on this slide, sequela of viral encephalitis include conditions classified in B15 to B19, specified as such, and late effects present 1 year or more after onset of the causal condition. It does not include chronic viral encephalitis, which should be coded as an active disease. In the example, you'll notice that on line A is reported chronic brain syndrome, 5 years. Because there's a late effect, chronic brain syndrome, present 1 year or more after the onset of the causal condition, viral encephalitis, we will code line B, the viral encephalitis, to the sequela code rather than to the active infection code. So line B is coded to B94.2, sequela of viral encephalitis. ICD-10 code B94.8, sequela of other infectious and parasitic diseases, provides a sequela code for the remaining conditions in Chapter 1. Let's read. Sequela of other infectious and parasitic diseases include conditions specified as such or as arrested, cured, healed, inactive, old, or quiescent. Sequela also include conditions present 1 year or more after onset of conditions classifiable to categories A00 to B89, unless there's evidence of active disease. It does not include chronic infectious and parasitic diseases, which should be coded as active infectious and parasitic disease. So looking at the example, on line A, we have chronic nephritis that has been present for years. So 1 year or more after the onset of the condition causing it, which was scarlet fever. There's a code in Chapter 1 for scarlet fever when it's active. But in this case, because death occurred years after, we're going to choose to code it to the sequela code provided, which is B94.8, sequela of other specified infectious and parasitic diseases. As mentioned before, the classification does not provide a separate sequela code or code category for every condition, but here's another example. Sequela of rickets, E64.3. Sequela of rickets include conditions originally classified to E55, stated to be a sequela or late effect of rickets, or previous rickets as the cause of conditions present 1 year or more after the onset of the rickets. Looking at this supplementary example, take note of the fact that the decedent was a 99-year-old lady. On line C, it's reported that she had rickets in childhood. As a late effect of those rickets was some curvature of the spine and bronchopneumonia as a result of that. We do not want to code those rickets as active. We will, in fact, on line C, apply the code E64.3, sequela of rickets. One last instruction from Volume 2, ICD-10, subsection 4.3.6, and that is the instruction for sequela of inflammatory diseases of central nervous system, G09. This category is provided for coding the sequela of conditions classifiable to G00, G03 to G04, G06, and G08. It should not be used for chronic inflammatory diseases of the central nervous system. Code these to the current inflammatory disease of central nervous system. The example we chose to illustrate this instruction has on line A chronic hydrocephalus due to meningitis. Here we are using the chronic nature of the condition due to meningitis to suggest that the meningitis is no longer active, but rather residual. Therefore, we will code line B to G09, sequela of inflammatory diseases of central nervous system. ICD-10 offers I69 a separate code category for sequela of cerebrovascular disease. This is very useful for presenting accurate mortality statistics because it allows for a distinction between a catastrophic stroke causing death in its active phase or a similarly catastrophic stroke that caused residual effects that later on played a role in the chain of events leading to death. The underlying cause of death in both cases is the stroke, but in one case, death was immediate, while in the other, death was later after as much recovery as possible was made from the stroke. There's a note about the use of code I69 in Volume 1 of ICD-10, the tabular list. Let's have a look at that note presented here on this slide. I69, sequela of cerebrovascular diseases, ICD-10, Volume 1. The note says category I69 is to be used to indicate conditions in I60 to I67.1 and I67.4 to I67.9 as the cause of sequela, themselves classified elsewhere. The sequela include conditions specified as such or as late effects or those present 1 year or more after the onset of the causal condition. Not to be used for chronic cerebrovascular disease, these should be coded to I60 to I67. There's no specific mortality classification instruction for the use of I69 sequela of cerebrovascular disease in Volume 2 at Section 4.3.6. As part of the introduction to coding sequela for certain conditions, I mentioned that an excellent source of supplementary instructions can be found in the NCHS Instruction Manual Part 2B. The link to this manual is included here again for your reference. On the next few slides, I'll present instructions for specific sequela codes not covered in Volume 2. Here's how the use of I69 and its 4 character subcategories is described in the NCHS Instruction Manual 2B. The format of the instructions is slightly different, and I didn't make the whole entire slide blue, but these instructions do not appear in Volume 2 of ICD-10, but rather in the NCHS Instruction Manual Part 2B. In that manual, it tells us use I690 to I699 for the classification of cerebrovascular disease, conditions in I60 to I67.1 and I67.4 to I67.9 if a statement of late effect or sequela of cerebrovascular disease is reported, with a very straightforward example. In Part 1, on line A, certified sequela of cerebral infarction. The instruction is to code sequela of cerebral infarction as indexed I693. Next instruction on this same thing, the use of I690 to I699. Use I690 to I699 for the classification of cerebrovascular disease if a condition with a duration of 1 year or more that was due to one of these cerebrovascular diseases is reported. An illustrative example, in Part 1, on line A, hemiplegia, 1 year duration, due to an intracranial hemorrhage. We have a condition with a duration of 1 year or more certified as due to a cerebrovascular disease. Therefore, the instruction is to code that cerebrovascular disease, in this case, intracranial hemorrhage, to sequela of other non-traumatic intracranial hemorrhage because the residual effect has been certified. So we're going to use the code I692 for intracranial hemorrhage in its residual phase. Next instructions still for the use of I69 to represent cerebrovascular diseases as a sequela if the cerebrovascular disease is stated to be ancient, history of, old, remote, or if the interval between onset of the cerebrovascular disease and death is indicated to be 1 year or more, whether or not a residual effect is specified. 2 examples squashed onto this page. In the first example, the cerebral thrombosis on line B is described as remote. That is an indication for the use of the sequela of cerebrovascular diseases code. So line B will be coded to I69.3 sequela of cerebral thrombosis because it was described as remote. Second example, just a single condition in Part 1 on line A, intracerebral hemorrhage specified as old. Again, that will be coded not to an acute intracerebral hemorrhage, but rather sequela of intracerebral hemorrhage as indexed at I69.1. One more instruction. We're to use the sequela of cerebrovascular disease code category if the cerebrovascular disease is reported with paralysis, any kind, stated to be ancient, history of, old, remote, or if the interval between the onset of the paralysis and death is indicated to be 1 year or more, whether or not the residual effect is specified. This example included on the slide has in part 1 on line A, CVA with old hemiplegia. The cerebrovascular disease, CVA, has been reported with paralysis stated to be old. Therefore, we're going to use the sequela of CVA code on line A, first position. We're going to code sequela of CVA because it's reported with hemiplegia stated as old. Another separate sequela code in ICD-10 is O97, death from sequela of obstetric causes. Statistically, it's important to be able to present maternal deaths as those occurring during pregnancy, delivery, and the puerperium, and those occurring outside this period. Therefore, we need to have a good understanding of how to code sequela of obstetric causes. There's a note in volume 1 of ICD-10. I have it here on the slide. Let's have a look. 097, death from sequela of obstetric causes. This category is to be used to indicate death from any obstetric cause occurring more than 1 year after delivery. The sequelae include conditions specified as such or as late effects or those present 1 year or more after delivery. There's no specific mortality classification instruction for this code in volume 2, but there is some help for us available in the NCHS instruction manual. In NCHS instruction manual part 2B, we're told that we can use this category, 097, sequela of obstetric cause, for the classification of an obstetric cause, conditions in 000 to 0927, if a statement of a late effect or sequela of the obstetric cause is reported, or if a chronic condition or a condition with a duration of 1 year or more that was due to the obstetric cause is reported. We're going to have a little bit more about 097 in the next part of this presentation, but here we're getting some guidance for the application of that code from the instruction manual 2B. One last sequela code to look at is sequela of external causes. On the slide is the note included in ICD-10 Volume 1. It says that categories Y85 to Y89 are to be used to indicate circumstances as the cause of death, impairment, or debility from sequela or late effects, which are themselves classified elsewhere. This sequela include conditions reported as such or occurring as late effects 1 year or more after the originating event. Again, no specific mortality classification instructions for the use of these codes in Volume 2. However, there are instructions in Instruction Manual Part 2B from the NCHS. Before going to those, I just repeat a slide that we had earlier. There we are. Just to show you the list of sequela of external cause codes. Y85 0 to Y85 9, for example, is specific to sequela of transport accidents. Y86, sequela of other accidents. So that code range covers all the external causes. There's a place to put all of them in a sequela code category if the requirements are met. So let's look at some helpful instructions from NCHS Manual Part 2B. Sequela of external causes, Y850 to Y899. Use Y85 to Y89 with the appropriate fourth characters for the classification of external causes of injuries. First criteria. If a statement of sequela of the external cause is reported, unless the interval between date of external cause and date of death is less than 1 year. In the example, we have on line A, paralysis, comma, sequela of fall down steps. A statement of sequela of the fall has been reported. There's no evidence that the interval between that fall and death was less than a year, so we will code the fall as a sequela of fall downstairs, which would be a sequela of other accidents at Y86. Notice too that the paralysis, we won't land on this for long, but the paralysis is also coded as a sequela of the actual injury code. Another instruction for the use of Y85 to Y89 sequela of external causes is an injury that is stated to be ancient, healed, history of, late effect of, old, remote, or a delayed union, malunion, or non-union of a fracture that was due to an external cause. In cases like that, the external cause is coded to the sequela code. So for example, A non-union of hip fracture reported on line A as due to an accidental fall at home on line B. Line A is coded as indexed, and then line B is coded as a sequela of fall since the fall resulted in a non-union of fracture. Another instruction for the application of the sequela of external cause codes Y85 to Y89 is if the external cause is stated to be ancient, history of, old, remote, regardless of the reported duration, or the interval between the onset of the external cause and death is indicated to be 1 year or more. In the example included on this slide, the external cause, fall, is described as old. It's stated to be old. Therefore, the fall is coded to the sequela code Y86, sequela of other accidents, because the fall was described as old. One more instruction for the proper use of Y85 to Y89 sequela of external causes is when those codes are used if a condition with a duration of 1 year or more that was due to the external cause is reported. For example, on line A, a subdural hematoma with a duration of 1 year reported as due to a fall. Well, the fall be coded to the sequela external cause code category because it resulted in a condition of 1 year or more duration. In this case, the accidental fall, the sequela code is Y86. This is the last instruction for the use of the sequela of external cause code. We're to use that code if the interval between the time of occurrence of the external cause and death is indicated to be 1 year or more, whether or not there's a residual effect specified. In the illustrative example, we have in part 1 on line A bronchopneumonia. In part 2, we have information about a contusion to the brain, a collision between a bicycle rider and a truck, and the information that tells us how to code that external cause, the collision between pedal cyclist and truck, is that the date of injury was in 2020, the date of death in 2024. The interval between the time of occurrence of the external cause and death is indicated to be 1 year or more. Therefore, we will code sequela of external cause. And in this case, the correct 4-character category code for that is Y850. This is in fact the last instruction for the use of ICD-10 sequela codes in this presentation. Although we haven't explored every single sequela code in the classification, I hope you feel equipped to apply the instructions included in volumes 1 and 2 of ICD-10, as well as the supplementary instructions found in NCHS Instruction Manual 2B. The second section of this particular session is based on subsection 4.3. Specific instructions for other ICD-10 categories. This is the last part of the instructions, mortality classification instructions included in volume 2. And the instructions in this subsection address code categories where there may be some need for further instructions to support accurate and consistent application. For example, accurately and consistently coding heart disease specified or interpreted as rheumatic as either active or inactive can present some difficulties. These particular instructions on the next couple of slides have been revised and updated a number of times in an effort to clarify them. This is the very latest version implemented by the WHO in 2019, which is a rare departure from our constant use of the 2016 version of Volume 2. But let's have a look together. Specific instructions on other ICD-10 categories. The first one, rheumatic fever with heart involvement, I01, and chronic rheumatic heart diseases, I05 to I09. Rheumatic heart diseases are classified to rheumatic fever with heart involvement or chronic rheumatic heart diseases, depending upon the rheumatic process being described as active or inactive. If there's no statement that the rheumatic process was active or inactive at the time of death, code the following cardiac conditions as active, i.e. rheumatic fever with heart involvement, I01. So I'm going to read this and this instruction and the ones on the following slide. But what we're saying here is if you have a condition with a rheumatic heart condition with no statement as to whether the process was active or inactive at the time of death, here are some guidelines. A cardiac condition reported as due to rheumatic fever, except for cardiac arrest, acute heart failure, and bacterial endocarditis, should be coded as active. Carrying on, a cardiac condition specified as rheumatic and described as acute or subacute should be coded as active. Carditis, endocarditis, heart disease, myocarditis, or pancarditis described as rheumatic or reported as due to a rheumatic disease, and the interval from onset to death is less than 1 year, code is active. And last, carditis, endocarditis, heart disease, myocarditis, or pancarditis described as rheumatic or reported as due to a rheumatic disease, and the deceased is less than 15 years old, then that rheumatic heart disease should be coded as active. I'd just like to remind you that some of the instructions in Volume 2 are a little bit complicated, but you are never required as a coder of cause of death to memorize these. I would like you to be aware that there are some instructions around the proper coding of rheumatic heart diseases. I'd like you to remember that these instructions are in Volume 2. And if you are coding a record where you need to apply these instructions, you would know to come back to them and compare your record to these instructions and apply appropriately. Here's a very old instruction that you're probably familiar with already. In section 4.3.7, there's an instruction around pneumonia and immobility. It says code pneumonia in J18.0 to J18.1 and J18.8 to J18.9 reported with immobility or reduced mobility to J18.2 hypostatic pneumonia unspecified. This instruction, as it appears in Volume 2, Section 4.3.7, predates an update that I put on the slide as well. That exact combination of codes is presented in Section 4.2.5, Special Instructions on Linkages and Other Provisions, Step M1. All those special instructions were dealt with in a different presentation. Why this happened is because the original instruction at 4.3.7 predated mobility having its own ICD-10 code. At some point, ICD-10 was updated to include R26.3 immobility, and that allowed for an update to the special instructions on linkages and other provisions in Step M1. Just something interesting about ICD-10 and instructions for mortality classification. Here are the 3 categories. I said we would come back to maternal deaths and obstetric causes. It's important to be able to present mortality statistics that separate maternal deaths occurring during pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium from those occurring after this time period. This instruction on the slide spells out the use of the codes representing maternal deaths occurring after the pregnancy, childbirth, and puerperium. If you'd like to read along with me, there are 3 codes: obstetric death of unspecified cause, 095, obstetric death 42 days to 1 year after delivery, 096, and sequela of direct obstetric cause, 097. It says on the slide, categories 095, 096, and 097 classify obstetric deaths according to the time elapsed between the obstetric event and the death of the woman. Specific instruction for category 095 on the slide is to be used when a woman dies during pregnancy, labor, or delivery, or the puerperium, and the only information provided is maternal or obstetric death. If the obstetric cause of death is specified, do not use 095, but code to the appropriate category. Okay? In other words, if all you know about the cause of death for a woman is that it was maternal and it occurred during pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, you use code 095. If you know anything about the actual cause, you don't use 095, you code to the other codes in the chapter over 095. And then the other 2 code categories, a category 096 is to be used to classify deaths from any obstetric causes that occur more than 42 days, but less than a year after the termination of the pregnancy. 4th character subcategories specify the obstetric death as direct, indirect, or unspecified. That's in blue because that bit of information is not included in the instructions in 4.3.7 because they were not updated after code 096 was updated to have subcategories. Similarly, you'll notice that It says category 096 is to be used to classify deaths from direct or indirect is struck out because 096 is for any obstetric causes occurring more than 42 days but less than a year after termination. And the newer 4-character subcategories specify that cause as direct, indirect, or unspecified. Similarly, 097 is used to classify deaths from any obstetric cause, no longer specified as direct, that occur 1 year or more after the termination of pregnancy. And that's because now there are 4-character subcategories that specify the obstetric death as direct, indirect, or unspecified. Okay, once again, we've made a small exception to our exclusive use of the 2016 version of Volume 2 and include here an update made to those instructions to bring them in line with updates made to the code categories themselves. The use and application of the code is not affected, though. I expect you're already coding perinatal deaths according to these instructions, but if you've ever wondered why, here are the original guidelines for coding perinatal deaths, all coded to P00 to P96. Chapter 16. The instruction says use a code from Chapter 16, certain conditions originating in the perinatal period, if the condition is indexed to a code in Chapter 16, or if there's an index entry for the specified condition qualified as congenital perinatal newborn, and the duration of the condition indicates that it developed in the neonatal or perinatal period. This applies even if the condition is not specified as neonatal or perinatal on the certificate. On the slide, there's a little note saying that some conditions diagnosed below a specific age, it's assumed that these conditions are congenital, and subsequent instruction that we'll get to momentarily. Right now, we're looking at using a code from Chapter 16 for certain conditions originating in the perinatal period. Further, for children less than 28 days old, assume a reported condition developed in the perinatal period unless the duration is stated and onset was definitely after the first completed week of life. Note that there are some conditions excluded from Chapter 16, but perinatal or newborn conditions. There's a long list on this slide and the next, I think, 2 slides that show this. So, for example, tetanus neonatorum is not included in Chapter 16 as a P code, but rather in Chapter 1 as an infectious and parasitic disease, as an example. Looking at the next slide, neoplasms arising in the perinatal period are still coded to Chapter 2, C00 to D48. There's no Chapter 16 code for neoplasms arising in the perinatal period. And on the third slide of this list, just some more conditions that, although they are associated with the perinatal period, they do not have a code in Chapter 16. And in these cases, a lot of them aren't actually going to appear on death certificates, but when they do, in these cases, they're to be coded as indexed. The next specific instruction on other ICD-10 categories is for congenital conditions. Again, you'll see that I left this visible to you, the strikeout of the old name of the instruction, and the new one is congenital conditions. I included on the slide the statement that this is as per a WHO updated implemented in 2019, just for clarification. It really doesn't matter. But this straightforward coding instruction is designed to improve the quality of coded cause of death data by taking account of the interval between the onset of the condition and death. So if a condition has existed from birth, it should be coded as congenital if the index allows for that, without regard to the age of the decedent, as per the instruction. This is why in mortality statistics, we'll sometimes see an elderly decedent with a Q code. But if the cause of death has existed since that person's birth, it's congenital and should be coded, if possible, coded as congenital. Next instruction related to congenital conditions. On the slide, it says, further, the following conditions should be coded congenital at the ages stated, provided there's no indication that they were acquired after birth. If the decedent is under 1 year, aneurysm, aortic stenosis, atresia, atrophy of brain, etc., should be coded as congenital, unless there's an indication they were acquired after birth. Similarly, if the decedent is under 4 weeks of age, heart disease and hydrocephalus, not otherwise specified, are assumed to be congenital. This instruction is designed to allow for an assumption these specified conditions to be congenital, even when not specified as such, but when occurring in decedents at these specified ages. The reason for this is that these listed causes of death are not indexed directly to a congenital code. And of course, these instructions do not apply if the certifier specifies these conditions as acquired. Another instruction for a specific ICD-10 code category: multiple injuries in the same body region, S00 to S99, injuries involving multiple body regions, T00 to T07. In multiple cause coding, do not use the codes for multiple injuries of the same body region or codes for injuries involving multiple body regions if specific information on the injuries is available. Code injuries separately and use as specific an injury code as possible. Remember, the goal of multiple cause coding is to enhance the usefulness of the mortality data by adding detail to the underlying cause of death selected for statistical tabulation. And in the case of multiple injuries, more information is retained if each injury is coded separately with as specific an injury code as possible. The codes for multiple injuries of the same body region and for injuries involving multiple body regions are not invalid, but should only be used when there's no other specific information available. You'll notice that the lettering here on this slide, this instruction for complication of surgical and medical care, has been adjusted to take account of the updates made for clarification in 2019. But it's not a new instruction. It was in the 2016 version of Volume 2, and it says to us, whenever a complication of a procedure is not indexed or is not a synonym of an inclusion or index term, code early complications and mechanical complications to T80 to T88. Code late complications and long-standing complications of organ function to the appropriate system chapter. For this, I present the instruction and refer you to the video made, step M4, including section 4.2.9, special instructions on surgery and other medical procedures. And finally, we come to the last slide in the presentation. And at this point, you'll notice that all the subsections of section 4.3, coding instructions for mortality, multiple causes, all of them have now been covered. A reminder, there will be a short coding exercise made available for you to try just to assess your understanding of the material presented. And as always, you can get in touch and ask any questions you have. There were a lot of slides in this presentation, and some of the material may have gotten a bit monotonous. Apologies for that, but if you have questions, please be in touch and we will help you out with some answers for those questions. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye for now.